Under normal circumstances, I'd have just grabbed his water up here, but I thought in front of 100 and something people, they might go, It's just the air of pollen in West Tennessee, East Tennessee, and all over Alabama and Georgia and anywhere else you're from. But we're glad you're here. And this morning after services, as I mentioned a little earlier, we are going to honor our seniors. Let me let them, would you please stand? It's the high school seniors. We want everybody to see. Now, Ronnie, have a seat. You've seen your years ago. This is our group. That, where's, okay, Jackson up there. And Tanae, okay. We got everybody here. So, and Parker's unusual, let me tell you. Okay, no, have a seat. We're glad that you get to share with us. Those that are visiting, please stay afterwards. We do have a barbecue catering service coming in and dropping some food off. And so we want you to know we ordered a lot. So even though you're visiting, be sure to know that we've got plenty of food and you're welcome to stay. We're talking about things I think that'll pertain to all of us. But I was thinking about the seniors as I put this lesson together. Defining you is the idea of what we're looking at this morning. Now, as I was thinking about this lesson, and I thought about seniors and what's going on, I thought, what better way when you're a young person, I'm not, I know, to do a Google search and see, who am I? And see what kind of ideas and young people, and maybe I'll read through all of these real quick. Well, there were 7,600,000 something number of hits, that is suggestions or ideas on defining you, or who am I, is what I typed in on that. Can you imagine? Which tells me there's a lot of people besides high school seniors or college seniors or anybody else, whether you're getting ready to retire, any gamut in here that's trying to still figure out who are we? And it's an appropriate lesson for any of us. People that are graduating from high school or on the verge of getting married. We have couples that have just gotten married just a few weeks ago. Welcome back, by the way. They've been here for a couple weeks now. Fantastic things going on. And yet we're still wondering, who are we? We have people that are confused about whether they're male or female living in this country. They're born one way and changed another way. And they're disturbed about who they are, what's going on. And we're all confused about this, at least some of us, in one way or another. So it's a question. And I'm going to suggest to you this morning that you allow God to define you. As you venture into trying to figure out who you really are, whether you're deciding on what path you're going over the next 4 years or the next 10 years or what you're doing in your life or anywhere else, to stop and pause at this moment and just ask yourself, who am I really? And then let God answer the question defining who you are. And the reason we ought to do that, first of all, is because He created us. And you know that in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the description that goes on there that talks about how God created the world. And He named that first individual, naming rights God had in the creation. Not only defining who Adam was and gave him a role and a job to perform and a wife to live with him and a place to go, but He's describing what's happening here. The psalmist, hundreds of years later in Psalm 139, will talk about this venture that's going on and how God knows what's going on. As he writes, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." Now, I want you to know it's past tense. He's known him all the time. He hadn't just found him today. Oh, I got to know you today. But God's known all about any one of us, and He's watched you grow up. I remember, I'm going to pick on some of these high school seniors. Parker, stand up here. He doesn't mind. Parker's a good buddy. Parker was just this little bitty thing back a few years ago. Parker, come up here. I'm going to really embarrass you. What size shoe do you wear now?
I don't know. I think the same as yours.
Same as mine. Isn't it a 14? Look at this height. How do people grow up so quick? You can have a seat now. I've embarrassed you enough. And I won't do anybody else seniors, promise. But God has been watching him grow up. This is my point. You know, I just turned around, all of a sudden Parker was down here. Now he's up here in size shoes, or, you know. But God's been watching the progress of each one of you over the years. He's known you since way back when. He knows you better than you know yourself. Why shouldn't we allow God to define us? Because he knows us better than you know yourself as you're thinking about what's going on. He created you. And besides that, as Paul's preaching on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, and he's talking about this great God, and he says this to these big philosophers of that time: in him, in God, we live and move and have our being. I owe not only my existence to God because he made me. I'm a product just of my parents. You can keep on going back, and finally you get back to Adam and Eve. And God started the ball rolling, and he continues to be active, I think, in creation in every human being that exists today. And as we continue living and we're growing and going about doing our different things and making our choices, I want you to know that he's been active the whole time. And you're here today, you have what you have today because of what God has given you. In him, we live and we move about, and anything that we have, all of our being really exists around what God has done and continues to do through us. So God has put you together as a human being. He knows how human beings function than any scientist, any psychologist, any psychiatrist, any whatever, or pool all the brains together could ever begin to understand. So there's a good reason why we ought to allow him to define us. Naming rights. Matter of fact, renaming rights. I wonder sometimes if the name Moses wasn't given really by God. I realize if you go back to the Old Testament that Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the Nile and so gave him the name Moses, out of the water or something along that line. But it's God that set the whole ball of an action going. And so the choices that she made, I think, are because of what God chose to do. Or Genesis chapter 12. There's a man named Abram and a girl who marries him named Sarai, husband and wife. And later God will rename them, allowing God to define where they go and who they are, to Abraham and Sarah. You come to the New Testament, and Jesus comes along and he meets a fisherman. His name is Simon. Simon, I'm going to rename you. You were a fisherman. Now I'm going to make you a fisher of men. So as you're looking at what's happening here, God has these naming rights, the renaming rights. God has all of that because of how he has started the ball rolling and continues to keep us going. Naming rights belongs to God. Let's look at two descriptions this morning on this idea of God defining who we are. Now, there's a multitude of things that the Bible says about Christians and human beings that are following Jesus Christ. We'll pick out two. And the first one I want to look at is just being a child of God in and of itself. Ephesians chapter 2. There's, if you want to please open your Bibles, we're going to be looking at a couple passages here. And then we're going to wrap up, believe it or not, somewhat early. And we're going to have some time to have some fellowship together because that's part of our Christian life. And oh, how we have been missing that. But Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. This is what Satan has done to us. Paul writes to a group of Christians what God did for them when he says, and you he made alive when you were dead in your trespasses of sins. We were part of Satan's background. We belonged to him. And somewhere in the process, verse 12 says, this is where we were. That at the time when you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, that means you're outside of God's people, and strangers from the covenant of the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. That's what Satan has done in defining us as people of the world. But God came along, Ephesians 1 verse 4, with every spiritual blessing. Verse 4 says, and He chose us to be in Him before the foundations of the world, that we would be holy and without blame before Him in love, having predestined us to adoption as His sons. Now He looks at us as being an adopted child of God. That was part of God's arrangement from the beginning of the world. Knowing that as human beings that we would choose Satan, that we would choose to follow him. We would choose unrighteous ways because of temptations and lures and all the things that swell up within us sometimes of anger and hate and anything else out there that Satan can utilize to cause us to make bad or evil decisions. And God said, but I'm going to redefine them. I'm going to give them a new name. They're going to be my adopted children. Yesterday, I was in Huntsville, Alabama with my family, my daughter and son-in-law, and my 2 grandchildren I have. The oldest one's name is Mateo, and those of Central know who Mateo is, and they've seen him around on occasions when they're visiting here and all. Mateo is 5 years old. Mateo is from Nicaragua. Mateo was adopted 5 years ago. Today is the anniversary of their adoption date. The day that all the papers passed and they were given absolute legal acceptation of being child of my daughter, my grandson. Given the right of everything that they have to belong to him. Inheritance, the joys and everything else. And I've mentioned before, that day that we were down there and we'd just barely taken him into our arms the night before and he wasn't looking right. And so Bethany and all, we went to the doctor to see him and this guy's talking about all the things going on in Spanish and we're back and forth and he looks at me and he's trying to say in English, he goes, he's a lucky man. I thought, is he right? Man? And he goes, what he's saying was, this is a lucky little boy. He's looking at us as Americans. He's thinking, he's going to go back to America someday. And he's seen, like anybody else who's visited Nicaragua, the little kids that are living out on the street, that have no home, that sniff glue, that at the very best have a set of flip-flops. And when they're sleeping out on the street corners at night, they tuck the flip-flops in their arms and they curl their hands up like this and they sleep like this at night so they can have flip-flops when they wake up in the morning. What they had is what they had on them. That was their entire life. And they go around begging, and the government did offer them sustenance, but they took advantage of the tourists and different ones who would ask for things, and that's all they had. And this doctor looks at Mateo and he goes, that kid's not going to have that. By adoption, he's going to a better place. Adopted child of God with an inheritance. You know, the Bible talks about this inheritance here. He says down in verse 7, it says, in him we have redemption through his blood. We're now redeemed back to God. The forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. In verse 11 it says, in him we have been ordained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him. This is what God had always had planned. The description that God's giving us, a child of God, by the power of God, by the love of God. Wow. And so we go out into the world a bit confused by what we see. We look around at what they're viewing, choices they're making, and we have another opportunity, totally different than from the rest of the world, to choose to be redefined as a child of God. Now, number two, as we go along with this, the second thing, what it does is because you are a child of God, it lays upon you a whole new concept. Now, instead of moving from childhood, we're going to talk about soldiers, because a second description I want you to realize is that we are soldiers of Christ. In that very same letter that Paul is writing, when he gets down toward the end of the letter, he talks about in chapter 6 some things that we ought to be wearing because of who we are. He says, finally, my brethren, in verse 10, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not, he continues on to say, against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and things that are happening in the darkness. But now you're a soldier. And as a soldier, we are redefined with a totally different task than the rest of the world, just to go along and be now. But we're a soldier with a set of armor that's being described here. And at the end of it, it says, this is what you're to do. You are to stand with God. Allow God to define you. As you're making your choices of where you're going to be and what you're going to do, whether it's retirement or what college you're going to do or what classes you're going to study or who you're going to marry or when you're going to choose to have kids or what you're going to do in dealing with all these things, allow God to define who you are. You are my child. And so therefore, in that book of Ephesians, you'll read some things like, walk as children of God. Stand with Jesus Christ. Now, as we're looking at putting this whole thing together, I told you it'd be short here, is the fact that we've got 4 basic points in conclusion. I have worth, number 1, as a child of God, because of what God has done for me, because of his power. Number 2, because of that, I need to live adopted life. According to Ephesians 5, verse 8, he says, therefore you were once in darkness, but now you are in light in the Word. Walk as children of light. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it says, be not conformed to this world, but rather be transformed. In other words, don't let the world redefine you. God's given you a better life. You're now his children. Choose that. And then, as we've already said from Ephesians 6, put on your armor and stand. Because we're going to have to stand in this world. We're going to have to stand up and be counted. We're going to have to stand for Jesus Christ. We're going to have to stand for one another in the church. We're going to have to live differently. We're going to have to behave differently. And we're going to have to stand together in order to be victorious. And those things we have in Jesus Christ. In Jesus Christ. Have you been baptized into Christ? Are you living for him as a child of God? Would you today? Would you dare to step out and say, I'm tired of the world, I'm doing this differently? Would you come to him while we stand and sing?